Welcome to our part 3 series of the future of healthcare. I'm Dennis Stearns, and welcome to our clients and friends around the country and around the world. We have been examining healthcare from a lot of different dimensions this week, and this particular one is going to dive deep into the whole coronavirus area, what is happening, what has happened, what will happen in the future. And we have some, again, great special guests. And we'd like to say thanks to Wavemaker. Next slide, Bill. And so this is our agenda for today. And again, we have a very packed agenda for this discussion. And we'd like to say thank you to Wavemaker 360. Many of you were introduced to them last Tuesday or at our telemedicine conference. They're a venture fund, Southern California, that are doing a lot of interesting things in early stage healthcare. As important, they have tremendous networks, tremendous background, have been leaders in major health organizations nationally. Some of the entities that we talked about this morning, for those of you who tuned in, you may recall we talked about Optum, and you'll note that John Nackel was CEO of a piece of Optum, part of United Health Group that we discussed this morning. And so we have a lot of people with a lot of great background. Today we have two new guests, Kwame and Tina. Kwame, again, 12 years at the FDA, Deputy Director and Branch Chief. Tina, Healthcare Innovation and Strategy, a lot of great background there. So with that, let me kick it off to y'all and let's get started.
John, you're on mute.
It's a pleasure to be here again, Dennis. Thank you for bringing us back. I thought I'd start with this symbol for the Chinese word for crisis. We're in that crisis right now of COVID-19, and the symbol for crisis in Chinese is danger and opportunity. And I think most people are looking at COVID right now from the danger side. Not everybody's looking at it from the opportunity side. And yet from a venture company perspective, a venture fund, we look at things from an opportunity perspective. So you'll see some of that in here, but we want to give you the background on COVID, some of the epidemiology of that, and even some understanding of how the FDA and the regulatory processes work together to help solve some of the problem here. And then we'll get very granular and talk about what some of those opportunities might look like. Jay? So I like to, this is an old slide with a new picture on it. I taught at the University of UC San Diego for a number of years, and in UCLA. And I used this opening slide for discussion about infectious diseases. And I just put the COVID on here to bring you up to date that this is new in many ways, but not new in other ways. And so I start with this. How many new diseases have been identified in the last 50 years? New things like Legionnaire's disease, HIV, and the list goes on. How many new diseases have been discovered? And in that same period, how many new diseases have been eradicated? And these kind of statistics help you to understand the level of the issue that we're dealing with COVID. So Jay, if you take us to the next slide, the answers to that question are these. Over 330, 35, depends on who's counting, new diseases in the last 50 years. And yet, we've only eradicated 2. So when you think about COVID's going to be around for a while. Don't think of it as COVID's here, it's a once a century kind of pandemic. and it'll go away. Well, Spanish flu was 100 years ago, and the flu's still around. It hasn't gone away. It might be in 20 different varieties, 100 different varieties, but it's still around. And so eradication of diseases is a very hard thing to do, and especially globally. Even smallpox has popped up a couple of times since it was originally eradicated. There's been a couple of small incidents. It's for the last few years, it's been gone. But look at those numbers. I mean, they're really pretty impressive. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to let Tina walk you through this disease. And we picked nasty pictures because COVID-19 is nasty. So Tina, if you walk us through the epidemiology of the disease.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We wanted to start with the definition of a virus. What is a virus? Viruses are living organisms that live in cells long term. And they're the most biological entity on the planet. What's interesting is there is no cure for virus. The virus
Hey, Tina?
Yes.
I'm not sure, but I'm hearing your audio very good quality. Are the others on the panel able to hear Tina?
I think Tina may be having a transmission or Wi-Fi issue.
Yeah, the audio quality, Tina, was very garbled.
Okay.
Sounds like maybe you're back now.
Okay. I'll keep rolling here, and if there's a problem, I might send it over to John. Let's go to the next slide. I'm sure many of you are tracking the global effects of COVID-19 on your computer, on your TV, much like I have been. And as of yesterday, the grim picture shows that there have been 335,000 deaths globally. The question is, what can you learn from those who have managed to contain this virus better than others?
Tina, you're fading in and out. Let me just take it over so that we don't have a problem here.
Okay.
So the major thing we wanted to accomplish with this slide was to show you that there's really different practices around the world. And there's a number of best practices out there that have worked very well. So the rates around the world, it's hard to tell by a chart that shows confirmed cases or confirmed deaths, either one, because one, the accounting is not the same everywhere. And two, you have to know what the population base is as well. But let me give you some examples of some of the practices around the world. So Germany attacked the problem quickly and got people back to work quickly. And the way they did that was with testing in a very organized, planned manner. So rather than one-on-one testing, they started with testing 10 people. When you showed up at work, they tested 10 people at one time. And if it was tested positive, the 10 people all had individual tests. If they tested negative, all 10 could go into to the work area. And so by streamlining the process and addressing the process, they were able to make it a very efficient practice. Another example is Africa. And most people think of Africa as being behind in healthcare. And actually, they're actually ahead of most of the world in one aspect, and that's called public health. Because of all the viruses and the malarias and the Ebolas and all those things that they've had over the years, they control the public health side much better. Now, their infrastructure is poor. Their hospital systems, their medical care, the quality of surgeries, things like that are not on the par with the rest of the world. But public health actually is better. And so when you come into an airport, for instance, there's screening, there's temperatures taken, there's tests given, there's questionnaires filled out. Before they'll even let you into their area, their country, they screen for a number of different things. So some of the procedures that you might see in other countries start to evolve will actually be ones that Africa has used for a number of years. So we wanted to let you see that there's best practices. There's not a lot of sharing of those best practices at this point other than through learning type mechanisms. There's also a lot of worst practices, and you can see that one from the mortality rates and the morbidity rates, but also we'll see the double spike. It won't even be just from the initial reaction, it'll be the follow-on reaction. If you could go to the next slide, Jay. So the spread of COVID is fairly simple. It's person to person through the respiratory droplets. That's why the mask concept makes sense. That's why the distancing makes sense. So you can actually control COVID spread by social distancing and by masks. So the basic concept here is to prevent that respiratory droplets. It spreads very easily, and that's why the contact issue becomes a huge issue, and why places like New York City with a dense population and large numbers of people that come into contact with each other on a day-to-day basis. So the subways, the streets, the restaurants, all the social interaction in a city like that, why they got hit much harder than other places. The last comment there about aerosolization has actually proven to be not true. So it is not something that's caused that way. Jay? There are a number of risk factors with COVID. So different types of things. Everybody knows the aged one, and that risk factor, the top row, actually goes further and further right depending on age. This one was 65. If you picked 85, that blue mark would be well across the page. So age is a significant factor, and actually sex is as well, with men having a much higher incident than women, and then complications, whether it be heart disease, heart failure, arrhythmia. COPD tends to be a very big one because of the breathing problems, and smoking is clearly affects breathing as well. So those are all factors that affect, and it turns out that there are some medications like statins that actually result in a much lower risk factor. So we haven't quite figured out why that is yet, but people that are on statins, even though they're 75 and 80, actually have a better chance of avoiding the COVID. Next. So where does this bring us? If you think about how you're going to stop COVID, there's three avenues: testing, treatment, and vaccines. And let's start with at the end there. Vaccine is clearly the gold standard. That's where we've got to get to. We've got to get to 6 billion people around the world being vaccinated in order to get this disease under total control. Problem, it takes forever. It takes forever for a number of reasons. One, you have to develop the vaccine. So there's literally hundreds of companies working on developing a vaccine. Second, you have to get it produced. And while production in numbers like 10 or 20 million is the norm for these big drug companies, nobody does billions. So now we're talking about production being a major factor here. And the third part of it is distribution, getting it out to large numbers of people over time, and who has priority. And there's already concerns that the country that develops the first vaccine is going to vaccinate their own people first, and not necessarily high-risk people around the world, but rather developed here, so we're going to keep it here. So all kinds of concerns there. I'll let Kwame in a minute describe to you why the vaccine issue is is a problem from the FDA perspective. So let's talk about that when he gets on. So the second aspect of controlling COVID is treatment. Treatment's all about, you've already got the disease. Now, how do we make it the least amount of morbidity and the least amount of mortality with respect to the treatment? There's already been seen a number of drugs that have had some impact. The first of those is been now in mass production, but again, the same problem as before. We produced it in hundreds of thousands of doses previously. Now we've got to produce it in tens of millions and hundreds of millions of doses. So treatment is an issue. Also, the other thing with treatment is most of the drugs that are being tried are drugs that were developed for other reasons. Now they have to go through FDA again. So Kwame will describe for you all the issues with respect to the treatment side as well. So what does that leave us? It leaves us in the short term around testing. We're in a position where we've got to test. We've got to test large numbers of people. For people to get back to work and to get this economy going again, we have to test people on a regular basis. So we're talking about 350 million people in the United States. Even if you tested once a month, which is not very much, you're talking about billions of doses again. So billions of tests, I mean. So testing is a huge issue. A lot of the tests problems are fall into two camps. One is long time from the test taken to the test report. So you have a test taken and you hear 7 days later, well, in 7 days, you've infected lots of people. So that's one problem. And the second, even more important problem is false negatives and false positives. So you've taken a test, it tells you you don't have COVID, and yet you actually did. Now you're not only are out there in the community, but you think you're negative, and therefore you're spreading it even more. So testing is a huge issue. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to have Kwame give you one opportunity. I told you it was danger and opportunity. We'll talk about the opportunity there. So with that, I'm going to close with one other comment there, and that is, I believe healthcare is now the new horizontal. We've thought about healthcare as the vertical industry. It's actually now part of every other industry, and I'll get into that in more detail after Kwame talks. So Kwame?
Thanks, John. So all the products John just discussed are regulated by the FDA. But FDA also regulates medicines for animals, tobacco, and a range of other products that weren't on that slide. So if you took 5 seconds and guessed what percentage of the economy is regulated by the FDA, what would you guess? You don't have to put it in the chat, just guess to yourself. And the answer is 20%. So 20% of the US economy is regulated and evaluated for safety and effectiveness. And that process can take anywhere from a couple months to nearly a decade from concept to commercialization and finally getting to the FDA. And we'll talk about why that is. When we think about whether a regulatory body can be a friend or foe, there are some areas of key consideration. One, what market do you want to enter? There's a distinct difference in the regulatory process for Europe than the US, and the application type will play a big role. And finally, what timeline do you have on your roadmap to getting this product to patients? And then there are classic considerations about IP and speed. And when I think about speed in a regulatory body, there are three main drivers for any company to get through the FDA in the most efficient manner. They are market. That's what you can control first off, what market you want to enter. The second biggest lever are meetings. How efficient and effective can you manage your interactions with that regulatory body to get the key questions you need about the data set to get it approved or cleared? And finally, money. With the right amount of capital, you can devote the resources to run a clinical trial of 100 patients or 1,000 patients. And we'll talk about how you can think through those in the timelines on the next slide. So why don't we go to the next slide that reviews the relative timelines for products that are important for us through this crisis. So I lumped novel drugs in with biologics, and those were generally going to be the types of treatments or vaccines that we'll see get to market. And this represents a traditional process. And what I want to ask you to focus on is that middle arrow of 2 to 5 years. And that represents the time for a typical clinical trial for a drug. And that is what I talked about in terms of money. A company has to be well capitalized to execute and implement a trial of thousands of patients and manage for things like patient dropout, enrollment, and follow-up so that you can have a statistically meaningful data set that you bring to the FDA. And those interactions will be multiple, probably at least 10 interactions over the years to make sure that you're in line with the requirements the FDA will lay out for your product. In a typical medical device application, it's a shorter timeline, primarily because instead of a 1,000 patient or 2,000 patient study, the FDA will require one pivotal study that could be anywhere from 100 to 300 patients. Much easier to manage, shorter duration, typically shorter follow-up, and less meetings with the FDA. So again, money and meetings are key here. And we're in a crisis, so let's spend some time talking about the emergency use authorization. That process has been around for years, but it's never been used to the extent it has now. John mentioned this, but there are hundreds of companies, and this is not an exaggeration, hundreds of companies going through a process that typically is managing a tenth of that for a crisis. Again, this is a stood-up organization that knows how to act fast, and typically from beginning to end, the FDA will commit to reviewing a solid application in 2 weeks. The total process from beginning to end, because we're talking about a data set of maybe 60 clinical samples for the product that we're involved in, will take 2 to 3 months. So I want to contrast how the FDA, the level of rigor for a traditional process and the EUA process, and also talk about the fact that over the last several weeks, we've seen a promulgation of guidances that have relaxed the requirements for companies making products to address the crisis. Specifically, just yesterday, the FDA, as a result of this crisis, and we talked about workload, has said we are not going to meet our timelines for review of non-COVID related drugs because so many resources are being focused on addressing and evaluating the therapies and vaccines under review to address COVID. So that's an overview of the different timelines and implications. And let's go to the last slide that I'm involved with.
Yeah, Kwame, I wanted to interject a question here from our audience.
Yeah.
And let me try to consolidate this a little bit. So we've had a number of surveys out this week about how many people in this country would take a vaccine. And one of the surveys said that if the organization you were previously with, the FDA, approved it, 40% would take a vaccine, but that 75% actually want to take the vaccine if they knew it was safe. And then there's an awful lot of confusion about safe, what does that actually mean? So if you can kind of work that into some of the commentary, that would be great.
Yeah, I will address it actually in the next slide. I'll talk about safety from the perspective of the diagnostic that we're working on and try and talk about drugs. So John, Tina, and I have been fortunate enough to work with and I don't say this lightly, and I think John and Tina would agree, a rock star startup management team with a CTO that developed a diagnostic originally to detect Ebola. It was funded by the Gates Foundation. They've taken that same principle of operations, a gold standard principle of operation, and developed a product, a diagnostic, that can detect coronavirus in a fraction of the time that we see for most diagnostics on the market. So whereas you see some that are being used that will detect in an hour, this is aimed to detect in 15 minutes or less. And this gets to safety a little bit, or not a little bit, it gets to safety directly. There are two key performance metrics for diagnostics, Dennis, in your audience. That's sensitivity and specificity. And that's another way of measuring whether the device has a tendency to say you have the disease when you don't, or not tell you when you do have the disease. So false positives and false negatives. So that's a main safety measure for diagnostics. What is exciting about this technology, in addition to the speed and accuracy, is its portability. So you can deploy this in a range of settings, not just in a big lab in a hospital, but eventually you'll be able to use this for people looking to re-enter a workplace, or they want to go to their favorite, I was going to say one of my favorite hip hop groups, but they can go to their favorite Led Zeppelin concert. They can do it with this portable device, right? On the drug side, typical adverse events are things that you have saw in the news. Heart arrhythmias is an adverse event. And that long study tries to measure it in a large population so people have confidence that they won't get an arrhythmia once they take this vaccine or therapeutic drug. And the FDA is expert at, because they have epidemiologists and clinicians and scientists, understanding the safety endpoints that need to be measured and making sure that they're characterized in that trial and followed after the drug is on the market.
Well, Kwame, I'm not sure you're going to want to touch the next question, or you may have to be careful in how you answer. But so the general question is, when the FDA has analyzed some of this, will we be hearing from direct leaders of the FDA, or will we be hearing it filtered through other channels that may be more politicized?
Yeah, so historically, the FDA has been apolitical. It's obviously the commissioner is nominated and confirmed. But what I've observed and what I suspect will continue is you'll see two main spokespeople three from a public health perspective. One, because we're in a pandemic, the Surgeon General. Two, Dr. Fauci. But three, the FDA commissioner will continue to be a spokesperson. He's science driven, and I expect that he will speak to issues for the medical devices, the vaccines, and the drugs. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
With that, if there are no more questions for me, I believe John is back up.
Yes, I am. And Kwame, I didn't even know you would know who Led Zeppelin was.
I got a lot of secrets. Yeah.
So, all right, how do we get this economy back open? And we picked one phased-in approach. You're going to hear the term phased-in approach many times. Different states have 3 phases, some have 4 phases, some have 5 phases. But they basically say, let's start with addressing it from a risk factor perspective. We want to keep people that are high risk away from people that could address the problem differently. So back to work, for instance, you'll see that the employer type, the business type, some things like car repair have never gone stopped. They were considered essential services. Obviously, the grocery store was needed, so it was an essential service, and the healthcare organizations were essential. But then what do you start with next? And there's a whole series of, and again, the items here are for Washington State, but they're different by every state. They open the car washes. Well, nobody in a car wash is that close to the next person. You're in your car, or your car gets pulled through it. House cleaning, you can stay away from the housekeeper, all the way to phase 4, which is the big items: opening up a concert, an NBA basketball game, large sporting events of any type, a large entertainment of any type. Those are where the real opportunities for contamination and spread of the virus happen. So it's a phased-in approach. Gatherings will be done in probably 2 to 3 week increments and gradually increased. Now, what's interesting is what somebody calls a gathering. In one country, it's 50 people. In another country, it's 2 people. I consider a gathering of 2 people a couple, but that's considered a gathering in some places. So it's going to be gradual, it's going to be phased, and we'll see how well Americans respond. That's the real issue. And I've seen it already. We saw the Lake of the Ozark footage over the weekend, and literally thousands of people at pools and sitting right beside each other in restaurants, no masks, and sitting side by side. So no social distancing and no masks. So in places like that, you're going to see a rise in the number of COVID cases. So it is going to depend on how well we do at this, and I'm fearful it's not going to go well. Next slide, Jay. So other than opening the business, opening the economy, what other consequences are there? Well, one for sure is bankruptcies. We've already seen it, some major names in the news. Hertz was one from the auto rental world. We're seeing hotels and hotel chains that are struggling. We're seeing airlines. And in fact, unfortunately, the CEO of Boeing even said, I'm afraid we're going to see a major airline drop off in the next 6 months. So you got real serious issues with companies that are going to have to seek protection of the bankruptcy courts. You got financial implications for any business. It almost doesn't make any difference which business. Healthcare in particular has huge changes. I think we're going to see much more movement to outside the acute care hospital. Some of that will be with telehealth. There's been over the last 2 months, there's more telehealth visits than there has been in the last 2 years. Home health is another one that you'll see more, and you'll see much more testing. So for instance, that little test, Fast Detect that Kwame just showed you, one of the hospitals that we're testing that product in is taking that device for elective surgery. They're going to the patient's home, doing all the paperwork with the patient electronically on a tablet, and they're taking that test. Now, if you test positive, you're not going into the hospital for that elective surgery. And by the way, they're testing for the visitors for that patient. So if it's the husband that's getting going in for elective surgery, the wife might get tested at the same time. And as a result, they're preventing that disease from even coming in the building as much as possible, or at least coming in a known way. We've got lots of societal implications. You know, we've had enough issues with immigration over the last 4 years without this. So now I think that's going to only exacerbate that. Social gatherings and events, entertainment, you know, when can the entertainment world start up again? And most likely see more discrimination going forward. So huge societal concerns that need to be addressed. Homelessness is another one that probably falls into that category. And I think we'll see some country recessions and maybe global recession. So the impacts of this are huge. This is not going away quickly. Mental health is another area. One of the problems with sheltering at home, one of the big risk factors for Alzheimer's is being on your own. So Alzheimer's could go up. Mental health needs, and we're already very constrained in mental health. We don't have great mental health services as a country. We haven't invested in that part of the healthcare system. So now the strain on that, suicides and other things, we think will go up as well. And now that we know what a disaster looks like, maybe we're going to need to spend more time on disaster preparedness and not just in pandemic kinds of things, but now we might spend more time thinking about other types of disasters. I know one of our big hospital clients here in Los Angeles does all kinds of disaster preparedness work, and even to the tune of nuclear and what they would do and how they address some of those kinds of issues. So that will be an area. Jay?
John, we have a question about
Sure.
the test that you talked about a little bit ago, and how does it differ from the Abbott Laboratories test?
Good. I'm happy to pick on that one because I know the Abbott IV Now product fairly well. Well, first of all, the Abbott product is made for large testing. So you do group testing, large numbers at a time. Its real problem is accuracy. It's only got about an 83% accuracy rate. And that's a huge problem because now you've got people that think they don't have COVID and do. And so the accuracy issue's a huge issue. And that's the difference with this particular gold standard, as Kwame described it. The qPCR approach is by far the best metric. It uses DNA, and it is really the gold standard. So the accuracy, we believe, for Ebola, for instance, and other viruses that's been tested on, its accuracy rates in the very high 90s, 99, 98%. So we believe it will have that kind of accuracy rate for COVID. We are entering into clinical trials with that product June 8th, a week from Monday. They start that next week, doing the final quantitative metrics on the device and building out the test device for the last couple pilots. They'll be going on at Mission Community Hospital in Los Angeles and the University of Missouri Medical Center. So the number one issue is that middle point there, sensitivity and specificity. The Abbott system is not very sensitive or specific. So that's the huge difference. The second one is speed. This one is 15 minutes to report. Most of the systems out there, you don't know until the day or two later. So you have COVID, you find out 2 days later, but you've been meeting with people and not socially distancing or whatever. You actually should be in quarantine if you have it. And then portability. The last thing is this will allow us to move this device to help open the economy. Think about testing. I mentioned the German approach to testing. They have 10 people combine their saliva in that particular case, test it, and then if it's positive, all 10 get individual tests, and if negative, all 10 move into the workplace. Well, you can't do that very well with a product like Abbott, where you have to test and you don't get the results for a couple of days later, and it requires a big machine with more sophisticated technology to implement. So all three of those facets are the big differences.
And John, we have one follow-up question. If your clinical trials go well, what's a reasonable expectation for it to be manufactured in quantity and distributed?
Great question. The company is working with the design and manufacturing functions to get the design to be one where it can be manufactured in large quantities. So the manufacturing, if it gets through the clinical trials, 2 weeks and 2 weeks to get through the FDA process, we're early July, and it goes into full manufacturing. We think we can produce a couple thousand per month right away, but the goal is to get up to 10 and 20,000 a month fairly quickly, and even to 100,000 by the fall.
Well, and so that brings up the last question of, and maybe you just answered it, are we looking at a world where the next 3 to 6 months of testing is done with a whole variety of different tests who all have different accuracy issues?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
It will not be uniform, and there'll be different functions out there in different places in different countries. You know, there'll still be the temperature first base kind of approach. Unfortunately, a number of people without symptoms, including temperature, have COVID. So you can have COVID and not have a high temperature. So that as a screen might help a little bit, but it really doesn't help much. You really do need to be tested by a highly accurate device. Jay, if you could take us back, and Dennis, if you have more anywhere along here, we're close to the done point here. So the other comment that I made earlier, and I want to reinforce again, is that I think healthcare is becoming a horizontal, no longer just a vertical. We think about healthcare as the vertical. Now it's going to be a piece of all these other industries. And I'll give you the example I like to use for this is, think about getting on a cruise ship tomorrow. How many of those listening would want to jump on a cruise ship right now? And the answer is probably none or fewer. Nobody wants to get on a cruise ship right now. We've had these problems for years, by the way. It wasn't just COVID. There's been botulism issues on cruise ships. There's been others. Now it's such a magnitude that the cruise ship industry has to embed healthcare into their service offering. So pre-boarding testing, more healthcare resource on the ship itself. Instead of a 12 by 12 room with a nurse, now you're going to have more of a full service healthcare facility. Better reaction to testing and quarantine type capabilities. There's going to have to be a component of that industry that has to address those things, or people won't ever go back to that service. And you can pick any one of these, sports and entertainment. I'm not ready to jump back in to go see a Lakers game. I don't like the Lakers anyway, so, but I'm a Celtics fan. So 20,000 people side by side, going out and getting their popcorn and their hot dogs and their beer. Not a place that you want to be right now without some kind of processes and procedures in there. So for a long time, we're going to see these industries, sectors, have a healthcare component to their delivery. Education, clearly that's true. You got colleges and regular K through 12 schools already trying to figure out whether they're even going to go back to school in August and September this year. but they're going to have a healthcare component to delivering their education services. You can pick any one of these sectors. Healthcare is now a component of all sectors. So it really is the horizontal. Jay? So this kind of goes to the question you raised, Dennis. If you think about vaccine, at best anybody's talking is late 2020. I happen to think that is more like the beginning of 21. But more importantly, it's not just having the vaccine. It's production capability. It's who's going to get it first. So the risk categories, the country categories, and then the large scale distribution. And, you know, we're like I said, we're talking about 6 billion doses. We're talking about organizations that have produced very well tens of thousands of doses at a time, not billions, not even hundreds of millions. So vaccine, we're looking at well into 21 and probably 22 before it's any kind of a level. The other way you get mass inoculation is by getting the disease, and that's actually the Swedish approach. Sweden actually went with the approach of protecting more of the elderly and allowing more people to get the disease. And that's worked to some extent, but it actually hasn't provided the level of inoculation that they originally thought they would get. So the near-term option is all about testing. The longer-term option is vaccine, and then treatment in terms of new drugs specifically for the disease, and taking drugs that already have worked for other diseases and getting them through the FDA process for COVID.
John, we have a couple of questions and I'll try to consolidate them.
We're ready for everything now, and Twami and Tina will join in on the questions as well.
Okay. Well, and so the question relates to the combination of herd immunity and vaccine. And there have been a lot of discussions about if we get a certain amount of herd immunity and a certain amount of vaccine, that's going to get us up to a magical percentage where things become better. And we heard you just a second ago talking about Sweden. What's the issue on herd immunity, I think, is really the question our audience wants to hear.
Tina, you want to try that first, and then I'll add color commentary?
I mean, I think that the immunity is very host specific. So I'm unclear if herd immunity is going to really work for the long term. I think that as we can certainly take community action and reduce the number of cases at a community level, but I think that the vaccine is really the eventual long-term play with COVID. That's my take. John, what do you think?
Well, nobody's really trying herd immunity for the most part. I mean, we've really only got a few places where they're trying that. So Sweden is the only country that's really on that track. And then most places are in COVID avoidance by masks and social distancing and shelter at home. And even when we go back to work, it will be 6 feet and, you know, social distancing and masks. So until we have vaccines, we're only trying to prevent it as opposed to herd immunity. So I don't see herd immunity working in the United States, and I certainly don't see it being taken by any other countries at this point. And especially because Sweden hasn't been particularly effective with it. Their immunity rate has not gone up any faster than other countries that have used social distancing as and sheltering at home. So I think we're looking at waiting for a vaccine.
Well, and possibly related to some of that is in our own country, question is around Florida versus New York State, and maybe more specifically New York City. Why Florida seems to have escaped a lot of the pain that New York is experiencing. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll start with density of population. The density of population in New York is much higher. Florida also has the benefit of heat. One of the things that vaccines, viruses don't do well in is heat and humidity, both of which Florida has in abundance, even in spring, in March, April timeframe. So I expect the spread of COVID will go down a little bit over the summer because we have more heat and humidity all summer long. So that's one issue. So, but density of population is clearly the big difference between the two locations. I mean, you don't have the subway system, the train system, the density of office buildings like you have in New York City. And while they may go home at night, they're going home in an environment where they're touching dozens of other people in a short period of time.
Okay, we have another question, and I'm not 100% sure where this is coming from, but let me throw it out there. Will this virus change or not be long lasting to require yearly vaccines? So and possibly one part of the question is virus mutating make it more difficult to create the vaccine? And then the other piece is maybe it just becomes part of the background, like you talked about earlier, like the flu that's happening every year.
I think both will happen here. So I think it will mutate over time, and therefore the vaccine issue will have to be an annual development type process. And actually that's true with flu today. I mean, the flu vaccine you get in the fall every year is actually a combination of multiple flus that have been seen or predicted to be coming. And as a result, it could be 10% accurate for the actual flu that happens that year, or it could be 50%. So the vaccines aren't 100% or even anywhere near those kind of levels at this point. In terms of how long COVID is going to stick around, I think we're looking at several years. This is not with vaccines, the timing, the production, and the distribution issues that I raised. We're looking at several years of COVID being around.
Okay. So another question, and maybe this is more for Kwame. I think there are some concerns that the FDA may be fully focused right now on COVID, and that there's a lot of other diseases killing people at even higher rates.
Well, you know, that's a challenge. That's the direct answer. So there's a set number of employees. You can't just pull someone off the street and make them a reviewer of a drug or a medical device. And this crisis and the strain it's put on the system at FDA is unprecedented. So that is the bad news. Let me tell you the good news. The FDA is expert at doing risk-based inspections of facilities and review of products. So they actually, in that guidance that I referred to, will be triaging the most important products to be reviewed and place a priority on them. That's not perfect, but it's smart. And that's exactly what the FDA is going to do. So the drugs, vaccines with the best possible chance of treating the most people for the most prevalent conditions are prioritized.
Okay. We have another one. Could they address the fear of taking a vaccine with rushed approval Will it be safe given limited trials and length of testing?
So what is happening to really shorten this process is the phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, and quite candidly, the number of developers that are working singularly on this process. The statistical design and the number of patients that are needed to show safety and efficacy won't change. So that bar isn't necessarily going to be lower. What's going to happen is all these developers are going to have a compressed clinical trial schedule, and then the priority review to make sure that they met the right endpoints. And quite candidly, you know, the reviewer that John and I are working with has to be working 12-hour days. They will sit and focus on that clinical study report and review it much faster than they typically would. So in that way, safety and efficacy won't be sacrificed.
Yeah,
Well,
adding to
actually-
that, let me just add a couple of comments
Sure.
to that is getting a vaccine out by itself is important, but having the confidence in it from the population is just as important, because people have to take it and people have to believe it's the right thing to do. We've had vaccines for lots of different diseases for years, and there's a lot of anti-vaxxers out there that won't do vaccines for anything. And so that's why I say, when the question came up earlier of, is this going to be around for a while? It's going to be around for a while, because you're not going to get 100% commitment to vaccines. I'll be surprised if we get over 30 or 40% within 5 years.
Okay. And so another follow-up question to that is, does the FDA, are they getting additional resources so that every single person isn't working 12-hour days, day after day?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'll give you the direct answer. I suspect they will be ramping up hiring. And again, they're prioritizing based on risk. And because we are, and everyone acknowledges we're in a crisis, they are not doing things like sending inspectors out, so additional resources can be focused on things like pre-market review. So they're making strategic decisions about activities they will do less of, so they can devote more staff to focusing on COVID. And part of that is hiring, and I suspect that there will be hiring. Now, we'll be candid with you. Again, the type of expertise and the backgrounds of reviewers, you know, most reviewers of these technologies have terminal degrees. They come from places like NIH. So there will be a hiring process, but it's not like hiring a coder for Google, which you could probably do in a couple weeks. But it is going to happen, and there is a prioritization of resources there.
Okay, and this one may be a little bit of a hot potato for you, Kwame, but the FDA has a history of just saying no or being very cautious. So I guess there's two parts to the question. One is, they're now pushed into an entirely different mode of thinking right now, and does that worry you? And number two, I guess the question is, should I be looking for my vaccines from Australia or someplace else?
So the one thing that I am proud of, and there's been some research in this space, that in terms of regulatory frameworks, how different countries evaluate products for safety and effectiveness, the FDA's process is considered the gold standard to ensure patient safety. And I still believe that. We are in unprecedented times. There are some relaxations that I know are risk-based that I've never seen in my 18 years in this space, working with regulatory bodies throughout the world. But I do think that they're thoughtful. The other thing I want to bring up is, and I want to restate it, there was already an infrastructure in place to deal with crises. So they're not learning while doing in that sense. And there already were processes to accelerate review for truly breakthrough technologies. So they're not, and I was part of those processes. One of them In its early days, it was called the innovation pathway. Now it's called the breakthrough designation. So the FDA has a capability and they have the muscle to quickly review products. It's just the magnitude is increased because of this crisis.
I would add to Kwame's comments there a couple of things. One is I agree with him 100% that the FDA process is the world gold standard. And while there has been a tendency to the word no, that goes back a long time ago to the 50s when thalidomide came out in England, and lots of babies were born with deformities, and it was kept out of the US because the FDA said no. So that story goes back, and as a result, no is the starting point. You have to earn yes.
Great example. A couple of other questions. I guess the question is the future of air travel.
Well, that's a loaded one. Again, like my example of getting on a cruise ship, getting on an airplane isn't much different. It's just a shorter period, that's all. So a lot of people don't want to get on airplanes right now and may not for a long period of time. So I was talking to somebody that needed to go to San Francisco from LA. They're driving up, and I'm not sure when they'll stop driving up for a while. So again, it may come down to when everybody's got vaccines, when everybody's got testing capability at a minimum, in order for the travel industry to get righted again. So this is a long-term one. I think the hotel and the travel industry and in airplanes, the whole travel industry, in other words, is set for maybe several years of contraction.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
Or Kwame, you want to add anything to that?
Sorry.
I was just going to add, I think there's also, in addition to the level of risk that a traveler might or might not take, there's also the haves and have-nots in terms of who's had the virus and who hasn't had the virus. That could impact over time the number of people that, if we believe that once you get it, you won't get it again, which we don't know for sure yet, that could impact capacity in air travel. And the other thing is every industry is trying to figure out operationally what they can do to protect those who come in their doors or experience their product or service. And that goes the same for airplanes and airlines. I was just looking last night, a friend of mine was traveling and I was trying to figure out, what the guidance was. And when you have empty planes, it's easier to social distance when you have full planes. And so I think the capacity issue and the ability for airlines to operate at half capacity or 1/4 capacity is also a big question.
Well, and I've heard some discussions about there may be antibody flights and non-antibody flights, which is a little bit crazy. That actually goes into another question around ability to screen for antibodies accurately. Anybody want to go after that one?
Tina?
Well, I know that there are some tests that do screen for antibodies. I don't know how accurate they are. There are others that can test positive if you have the virus, which is the one that we shared today. I think the real question is accuracy. And as new capabilities come out, I think that can be very helpful in determining what type of test you take and what that's going to tell you in terms of what you do with it.
And this gets to trust in government, trust in the FDA. Can they keep up? About 4 days ago, the beginning of the week, they put up a list of antibody tests that are inaccurate, and they told the companies to stop selling, stop shipping product. And that's a classic public health function of the FDA. And I was actually so pleased to see that they did that, to show that they're nimble enough to not only get product on the market reviewed and cleared quickly, but they also can equally act quickly when they see inaccurate tests. So to Tina's point, there's that safety guard there.
Okay, well, this next question, yet another hot potato. Will political pressure affect vaccine approval?
So my candid sense is there's a level of pressure on the FDA to move as quickly as possible. At the same time, the lion's share of staff are career employees. They're scientists that make science-based decisions. So to be clear, I think there will be pressure, but I still think that the decision-making process is still preserved and it's still based on the safety and effectiveness of those products.
Okay. Well, we have come to the end of our time. Any closing comments, John or others?
Yeah, I'll take that opportunity. First of all, I want everybody here to be safe and healthy. So I truly believe social distancing works. I believe masks works. And until we have a vaccine, we're still going to have to run our lives with this interference. So don't think that you can go to the Lake of the Ozarks and have 10,000 people that you run into and not come back with COVID. So I truly believe this is going to be an issue that's going to be facing us for a while. And Dennis, we want to thank the Stearns Financial Group for hosting us today and giving us the opportunity. And we've got our email addresses down below if anybody has further questions or opportunities that they want to pursue. We're all Wavemaker 360, first initial, last name. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And so an email that we got from the Lake of the Ozarks Chamber of Commerce, we will let you talk to them directly.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And thank you, Tina. Thank you, Kwame. We appreciate all of your input. And thank you all for tuning in today. Have a wonderful weekend. Next week, our Friday afternoon chat is on the future of work. Yet another interesting topic. Thank you all.
Thanks, Dennis.